Yeah, I mean, they were the leading bank in lending to venture capital firms or startup firms. These guys had assets close to $200 billion. This was about 2, 3 years ago, and they went bankrupt. Right? If you looked at their deposits, I mean, they technically had a relatively high capital adequacy ratio. I think, not going into accounting for different forms of capital, uh, they had close to 10, 11% capital ratio, which means you look at your risk adjusted assets, you divide it by your capital, and if you go below 4%, your regulator comes in and takes over. In fact, any bank that has a capital adequacy less than 8%, you need to be careful with that bank. That means for every dollar of their own money, they're lending $12 of roughly other people's money, or $11.50. Now, depending upon the kind of assets they have, that could be relatively safe or it could be dangerous. Example, not let's most of Silicon Valley's banks deposits were from Silicon Valley firms. You know, when these people borrow money, especially venture capital, they also kept their accounts in Silicon Valley Bank, which means they're not protected by FDIC because only $250,000 is insured, the rest is not. You and me don't have a problem, but if I have $200 million invested in Silicon Valley Bank, if the bank goes down, FDIC covers only $250,000. Even though they had uh, over $200 billion in assets, more than half of their deposits were these corporate deposits. And you also need to invest those into something. They decided they're going to invest about half of those assets into long-term treasury bonds. You're thinking, what's the issue, right? I'm going to give you kind of the, in a sense, uh, what do you call it? The analysis you do when somebody dies, autopsy of Silicon Valley Bank's death. We're going to find out the cause of death. Let's, I don't, I mean, I did take part in a consulting project about 6 months before they went down. In fact, my part in the analysis was because by law, you have to come up with a risk management model and get that approved by your regulator. So that was the project we were in. And I was part of the tools of risk management. I told them, I said, you guys have a deposit risk. I said, what deposit risk? I told them exactly what could happen. If something happened, your clients started taking out your money, and half of your assets are long-term U.S. Treasury bonds. If that coincided with increase in U.S. long-term interest rates, you guys are going to go below 4% in capital adequacy ratio. I even gave them an example. You know, since that thing is confidential, I cannot give it to you, but I'll give you the autopsy. Um, Normally, you attach a penalty to risky assets when you calculate your capital adequacy ratio. If I lend $100 billion to corporations I need to consider those risky because they may not be paid back. But if I lend $100 billion to US Treasury, they're not considered risky assets in terms of default risk. Here's what happened. US long-term interest rates went up by about 1% during the 6 months before Silicon Valley Bank went down. Now, if you remember from your basic finance class, the longer is the maturity of the bonds, the higher is the reduction in value of the bond in percentage terms. Roughly speaking, if the yields go up from 3 to 4, roughly your bonds are going to lose about 18% of their value. Okay, that's pretty big. Now let's see what happens. Uh, of course, Silicon Valley Bank, they have deposits, but they also use those deposits to fund the loans, right? So they need to fund that long-term bond portfolio. I mean, eventually it's going to be paid back by the U.S. Treasury, but you need to fund that. The way you fund the T-bond portfolio is you use what we call, we're going to talk more about that in detail later, the so-called repo market, repurchase agreements. It's simple. It's basically overnight loans collateralized by those treasury bonds. So I have $100 billion worth of treasury bonds, and you were Grayson, right? I go to Grayson and say, can I please borrow $100 billion from you? You say, I don't know you. What's the collateral? I say, here are these treasury bonds. You keep them. If I don't pay you tomorrow, they're yours. Okay? So sure. Tomorrow I'm going to buy those from you at a slightly higher price. I'm basically selling these bonds to you today at 100, tomorrow or 10,000, depending on the interest. I promise to buy them back from you tomorrow at $10,005. The difference being essentially overnight interest. If I don't buy them back from you, you say, well, you didn't pay me, so I keep these bonds. So those are your collaterals. When interest rates are stable, this is not a problem. So, but when interest rates go up by 1%, the long-term interest rate, let's round things off. Let's say that decreased the value of these bonds by 20%. Well, 6 months ago, when I brought you the bonds, you would give me 100 billion. Now I bring you the same bonds, and you say, by the way, I can't loan you 100 billion for those anymore. Why? Because their market value is only 80. So you give me 80. I still have to fund that 20. Where am I going to get that money? Silicon Valley's problem was this. So they actually went to secondary market. They tried to raise extra capital. You can raise what we call tier 3 capital. You borrow long term from the market, and they couldn't raise it. As soon as they couldn't raise it, there was a rush from their clients to withdraw their money, and they didn't have the money. As usually it happens, banks are not in the business of keeping their money in their vaults. Otherwise, how are they going to make money? I pay you 3%, unless I loan it to somewhere else to make 3.5, 4, 5, 6, whatever. I'm not going to make money. So any loans they have to call them back. Well, calling them back is not that easy. Maybe your clients don't have the money. So there is basically a run on the bank. And within a week, Fed came in and took them over. In order to prevent a nationwide panic, because this was a large bank, Fed said we're going to backstop all the deposits, even though they didn't have to. But Silicon Valley Bank did not exist anymore. I mean, it reopened, somebody else bought it, reopened with the same name, but they had to put in extra capital. So the bank went down because the capital was not adequate compared to the value of their assets. By the way, uh, if in 2017 the first Trump administration had not changed the Dodd-Frank Act, more than likely we wouldn't have had this problem.